change your world. It's time to let it go. The things you used to think, the things you used to know, they don't help you anymore. It's time to change your mind. If it's peace you want to find.
This is Kurt Kaikonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Change Your World, we'll be in the book of 1st and 2nd Samuel. So grab your Bible and let's get started.
It's time to change your world. You need to let it go. Oh, oh.
So Abigail, she's going to remain hidden until she comes up to David. And when she approaches David here, she doesn't come to him as an equal. She comes to him as a humble servant, and she came bowing. And she submits to David as a king, where she uses this word Lord 14 times in her speech to David. And with her first words to David, she takes the total blame for Nabal's insult on herself. And she tells him, it's my fault. And then she asks for permission to sleep. And she starts by telling David her husband is worthless. He's a scoundrel. And so she uses the same word, the man of Belial, that servant used, son of the devil, and that he's a fool, and that he lives up to his name. And she tells David again, it's all my fault, because she didn't know about David's request. And then Abigail, she starts talking about the Lord and how the Lord held back David from bloodshed, from avenging himself against Nabal. And so she's getting David to slow down and to see the big picture. You're going to be the next king. This is the kind of thing that you're not to do. And Abigail doesn't say that this gift is a gift for you, David, that it's not for David himself. She says, this is for the young men, because she doesn't want David to think that she's buying him off with her gift, that David could be bought off with food or with money. And then she asks him very straightforwardly, and she asks David to forgive her. And then she starts talking about David's future and about his high character, of how he fights the Lord's battle and that there's no evil found in him, and that the Lord had promised him a dynasty, an enduring house, and that what he's about to do would be a grief to him, the killing of innocent people. That's going to kill your conscience. That's going to hurt you. And you're going to feel this condemnation your whole life. It will put a black spot on your throne, and you're going to regret it. And then she confesses that Nabal deserves to be judged, and that the Lord will do that with Nabal and all of David's enemies. And Abigail, she never criticizes David here. She never scolds him about what he's going to do. All she does here is she builds him up. And then in the second half of verse 31, Abigail, she asks David to remember her after the Lord has dealt kindly with David. And when he thanks her, he doesn't really thank her first. What he does is he thanks the Lord for Abigail's advice, ever before he ever thanks Abigail herself. Because David sees this event as an intervention from God so that David wouldn't avenge himself and commit murder. And this admission he makes in front of all of his men, that this woman is right and that I am wrong, and that he had made a mistake. And then Abigail, she returns home, and Nabal, he's still drunk, and it never pays to argue with a drunk, so she waits the next day when Nabal's sober. And Abigail tells Nabal how close to death he really was. And it overwhelms Nabal, and the fear of his death, it either caused a heart attack or a stroke. People are divided on that. But whatever it was, Nabal was paralyzed for the next 10 days. And God took care of David's vengeance in just 10 days. And God struck Nabal dead without any innocent people ever being injured. And David knew that this was God's judgment. And then David remembered Abigail telling him to remember her. And so he sent her a message to see if she meant it. And David asked Abigail to marry him because she's smart and she's beautiful. And now she's rich, So what's not to love? And she didn't think it over very long because Nabal's dead and she's free to marry whoever she wants. And she sees no reason to mourn over that fool. So she becomes David's wife. And then we're told that David took another wife, Ahinoam, and we learn that Saul gave David's first wife, Michal, to another man. So now Michal, she's living in this adulterous marriage. And we're not going to get into the problems of multiple wives today. And so last week we left on a high note where we had a wedding, where David, he married the beautiful, intelligent Abigail, the widow of Nabal, the fool. And then there was a mention of David taking a second wife, Ahinoam. And now we start chapter 26 with a familiar scene, something we've already seen before, where we've seen the Ziphites come from Ziph, come to Gibeah to see Saul. And so now they're back again to snitch David out, that David is again hiding in their territory in the hill of Hachilah, where if Saul, if he was a man of his word, it shouldn't matter where David is hiding. But Saul's sorrow over his sin that he was feeling last week in En-gedi, well, that's past, which only proves that Saul never had true repentance, but that he only had an emotional experience when confronted with his sin. And David, he has nothing nice to say about the Ziphites. In Psalm 54, he calls them his enemies and that they're oppressors and that they don't set God before them. And just to let you know, the Ziphites, they are also descended from Caleb, just like Nabal the fool was descended from Caleb. So these apples, they are kind of falling far from the tree. And so Saul, he comes down to Ziph. And again, Saul, he's bringing this army of 3,000 choice men, which means this is all the best of the Hebrew soldiers. And this time when he comes, Saul, he takes the high grounds on the hill of Hachilah. And so this provides Saul better protection. But David here, he's not on the hill anymore, and he's safe in the desert. And his spies have been looking out for Saul. So David, he knows that Saul has come, and he knows exactly where he's camping. And the last time Saul came, David was hiding from Saul. But this time, instead of hiding, David, he seeks Saul out at his own camp. And so David, he's in a position where him and Abishai, who happens to be his nephew, who is a volunteer to go along with David, they can view and they can see exactly where Saul's sleeping. And in the King James Version of the Bible, it says that they were sleeping in the trench, which means that they were kind of sleeping in this wagon train, kind of like in an old Western movie where it's like the shape of a wheel. And here's Saul and Abner, and they're sleeping in the middle of that wheel with the men all around. And then they have all the baggage and the carts around the outer perimeter. And this is the very first mention of David's nephew, Abishai, who actually later becomes one of David's captains, along with his brother Joab, who is his more famous nephew. So now everyone, they're asleep in Saul's camp, and this is a deep sleep from the Lord. And they see Saul sleeping by Abner with his spear stuck in the ground along with Saul's water jug. And Abishai, he sees this as a second chance, where Abishai, even the last time, he was convinced that when they encountered Saul in the cave, that it was God who was delivering Saul over to David to be killed. And so to Abishai, this is now proof that God has delivered Saul, and this is our second chance to put an end to Saul's reign of evil over Israel. And so Abishai is telling David, I know you don't want to kill him, so I'll do it. So you're not going to have to feel bad about it later. And David, then you can always say that you didn't kill Saul. So you won't be going against your conviction. And Abishai, he says that he can do this with a single strike from his spear. And it's not that they couldn't kill Saul and win, but you can't strike Saul and be guiltless. And David, he won't take Saul's life, and he also won't allow anyone else to kill Saul, because David, he already resolved that issue in the cave last week in En-gedi. And David realizes that God will strike Saul one day, and that it's not hard for God to judge Saul or to kill him at any time. And those are those lessons that David had just learned last week with Nabal. But David does ask Abishai, and he says, don't kill him, but please take the spear and the jug of water by his head, and then let us go. And so this is a lot like how David had cut off the hem of Saul's robe. He's just getting proof that he could have killed Saul, but that he spared him again. And so they get the spear, and they go to the other side of the canyon onto a different hill, which is safe and far away, but where they could still call over and be heard through that canyon. And David, he's being careful not to humiliate King Saul, but he doesn't mind humiliating Saul's captain, Abner. And you kind of got a picture of this, where everyone, they're fast asleep, and it's very early in the morning, but it's already light outside, and everybody can see. And then out of the distance, in Saul's camp, they start to hear, Abner, Abner, son of Ner, aren't you talking? And so this wakes up everybody, and Abner, he gets up and he wakes up all tough and he says, well, who are you calling out to the king? But David's not calling out to the king. He's calling out to Abner, because David doesn't mind insulting Abner. And he questions his manhood. He says, are you not a man? And I'm not really sure what he's trying to say, but it sounds like David's calling him a woman, or maybe that he's a child. And so he mocks Abner, but he never mocks King Saul. And David accuses Abner of not protecting the king, and he tells him, because of this, you deserve to die. And then he points out to Abner that Saul's spear and his water jug, they're gone, and he's holding them up for them to be seen. And then David acts humbly and sincere, and he's careful to correct Saul gently, not trying to stir up Saul's anger. And again, he never puts the blame on Saul or accuses him. And Saul, he knows it's David because he recognizes his voice. And Saul knows that David has spared his life again. And so Saul calls out and he says, is that your voice, my son David? And so Saul, he starts by calling David his son again. Though David here, he's not calling Saul father anymore. But what he calls Saul is he calls him his Lord, the king. And David just asked Saul what he's done to Saul. And David says to Saul that if he's sinned against him, if that's it, and if this is of God, well, then let me just make an offering to God for my sin. But if this is just the people stirring you all up, like the people like the Ziphites, well, then let them be cursed. And then David makes his complaint, and he complains that he's not able to share in the Lord's inheritance anymore. And so what he's talking about his fellowship with God and his fellowship with God's people, because that's not available to him. And the only thing that's available to him are the false gods and the pagan temples with idols, and he's missing God's house. And then David, he starts to talk about how Israel's not safe for him anymore. And he compares his life to being like a partridge who's being hunted. And all you have to do to hunt a partridge is to chase them, because they can't fly very long. A partridge can only fly for like short distances to be able to get away. And what they do is they fly a short distance and then they run cover to cover. And they can only do that about 4 or 5 times. And then they're too exhausted to fly anymore. And then all you have to do is just kind of grab them, or you just bonk them on the head. And that's exactly how David's feeling, that he can't keep running like this. And that's all he's doing is he's running and he's hiding and he's running and he's hiding. And he can't take much more of this, because now this has gone on for more than 7 years that Saul's been chasing him. And then Saul, he calls back to David and says, I have sinned. Return to me, my son David. And although that sounds good, this time Saul's confession is different, because this time Saul's not crying. He's not having an emotional reaction. But Saul goes on and he says, for I will harm you no more, because my life was precious in your eyes this day. And then Saul admits, I have played the fool. And Saul is admitting this all by himself, and that he erred exceedingly. So Saul, he's now having this flash moment of honesty, which is not an easy thing to admit. But Saul, he's been sinning, and he's been playing the fool for years. And so this is Saul's autobiography about himself. And this is what he has done as Israel's king. He's been a fool, though David, he has never called him a fool. But too many times David has trusted Saul at his word, but now Saul, he has no credibility with David. And here, Saul's words, they're right, but there's no feeling behind them. They're just cold and mechanical. So David, he's not going to return to Saul because he doesn't trust him. And that's what David tells Saul. And that's why he tells him, he says, well, send one of your young men to come and get Saul's spear, because that's a polite way for David to say to him that he's not coming back with him. And what this makes me think of those who live in a cycle of violence, like a domestic violence or a violent abuse against children, like child abuse, where the abuser, they promise the victim that they won't hurt them again, but they can't keep their word. Where finally that recipient of the violence, they realize that that person can be trusted no longer, and it's no matter what they say, they're just not going to believe them anymore, no matter how much they love them. And I'm not saying that people, they can't change, but some people, they never do change. And if they do, sometimes it's too late, where you're done with them. And it's not that you hate them, but you're done. And David here, he's done with Saul. And then we have the last words that Saul ever speaks to David. And he says, may you be blessed, my son David. You shall both do great things and also still prevail, which are really nice words to part with. And then we start chapter 27, and it really takes after this last conversation that David had just had with Saul, where David, he doesn't really trust Saul's repentance. He doesn't believe him. And so David, he may have never said this out loud, but we're told here what David was telling himself in his own heart. And David is saying to himself that one day I will perish at the hand of Saul. And what he's meaning is that Israel's not safe from anymore. And then David's saying, there's nothing better for me than I should speedily escape to the land of the Philistines. And the key word here is that David is wanting to escape. He's wanting to escape from the life he's living. He wants to escape God's will for his life. He wants to escape to a place where Saul won't look for him anymore, because David's tired and he's feeling like that partridge that's being chased, where he can't hold on much longer because he's been living as a fugitive for this last 7 years. So he's been sleeping in the wilderness, in the cold, by the rocks and in caves. And he's having a hard time believing in God's promises. So he doesn't really care that much what God's will is right now, and he's not that concerned about becoming the king of Israel. And he might be thinking that he's not as strong as what God thinks he is, and that God, he thinks too highly of me. Where now David, he just wants a normal life. And it's not because God hasn't been faithful to David, because God, he's been very faithful, delivering David from every trouble. But now David, he's not going to seek God's will in this manner about his life. And he's taking his life back, and he's putting his life back into his own hands. And it's understandable that David, he'd be tired of running, living the life of a refugee, and that he'd want to settle down and consider maybe not as a normal life, but a more normal life. And that's because David, he now has 2 wives to take care of, besides this army of 600 men. And those men, they also have wives and little ones that they need to take care of. And it's very possible that David, at this time, that he's traveling with a company of 2,000 to 3,000 people. And you can read some of David's own thoughts on this in his own words in Psalm 13, where David says, How long will you hide your face from me? How long will I take counsel in my soul, having sorrow in my heart daily? How long will my enemy be exalted over me? And so here, David, he's at a low point in his life, and he's starting to look at God through his circumstances instead of looking at his circumstances through the eyes of God. And when you do this, you will lose your faith and you will lose your courage. And the enemy, he will take advantage of you. And him believing and thinking that Saul's going to kill him someday, he thinks, I might as well live with the Philistines. And Gath now, it looks better to him than Israel, because Saul won't follow him to Gath. And David's right, Saul doesn't. And you would think that Gath would be the last place David would ever come up with, because he's already tried Gath before. And going back to Gath and going back to King Achish, it will be different this time, because last time David, he was alone, but this time he has an army. And the Philistines, they're always looking for mercenaries. And Achish, he knows that David is estranged from Saul, and he's proven himself as a very capable warrior. And so Achish, he receives David at this time. And the thinking here is that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And David, he's really smart how he makes his request to King Achish, where he says, now, if I found the favor in your eyes, please give me some town in the country that I may dwell there. And David's reason that he gives to Achish is that he's not worthy to live in the royal city of Gath. And this would have been actually a relief to Achish, because this would relieve Achish of the extra burden to provide extra water and food supplies to David and his men. Where Achish, he already has to provide for a whole large Philistine population. And David, all he's looking for is a normal life, as normal as he can get. He just wants this little home in the country, just a place for his men to be able to raise their families. And it's always better to do this out of the eyes of Achish, so he won't be watching them too closely. And King Achish, he has no problem giving David the small town of Ziklag. And this is about 25 miles away in the territory of Simeon. And if you remember, Simeon's territory is actually located in the territory of Judah. But here, what you really need to see is how far David has fallen. And this has only been about 15 years where David was so outraged over God's enemies, over these uncircumcised Philistines. And that's when David killed Goliath, Gath's champion. But now David's here applying for his job, and now he's working for Goliath's old boss. And David isn't asking God his will in this matter because he doesn't want to know, because with just a little compromise, he thinks that he can make this all work out, that he can just be a regular guy. And that's not too uncommon for us believers in God, to get ourselves so far out of God's will where we can find ourselves living with the enemy and doing things that we would never see ourselves ever doing. And that's what David's doing here. And now you have to think, well, how is David making his living? And we're told in verse 8 how he's making his living, that they're raiding.
You need to change your world. You need to let it go. Oh.
Thanks for listening to Change Your World. Change Your World is an outreach of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, and your neighborhood church. If you're listening to Change Your World in the Detroit metro area, why don't you join us for church this Sunday? Our service time is 10 a.m. at Calvary Chapel, Waterford, 183 South Winding Drive, Waterford, Michigan. We're competing with the Catholics. It's only an hour. All the donuts you can eat, and you don't have to believe a thing we say, but it could change your world.
You need to change your world.
The rest of today's message can be heard at yourneighborhoodchurch.org. So check us out and download the app. And until next week, remember,